Hey guys, this is MusicTechHelpGuy, and today I want to show you how to use external MIDI synthesizers with Logic Pro 10. For this, we'll be using the external MIDI tracks along with the external instrument utility plugin. What I'm going to do is I'm going to send a MIDI signal out of Logic to a Yamaha Motif Rack XS synthesizer, and then we will take the audio output from the Motif back into Logic and print it in Logic as an audio recording. It's a rack mount synth with no keyboard, so we're just using it as a sound module. A lot of people have asked me to do this video, and I'm going to keep it as brief and simple as possible. It's entirely possible with Logic to have a whole rack of hardware synths and have multiple channels of external MIDI running, but for this video I'm just going to use one Motif synth, and this basically allows me to avoid having to talk about chaining synths or using a MIDI patch bay, which I'm pretty sure most of you guys don't have. Alright, let's talk a little about the MIDI and audio signal flow that we're going to use to send our MIDI signal out of Logic and then receive an audio signal back into Logic. This is basically the way my MIDI and audio setup is set up right now. You may think that you have to do something like this, where you have your MIDI controller plugged into the Motif rack via a MIDI, a standard MIDI cable, like a 5-pin DIN connector, and then your audio output goes into your audio interface. I'm using a Focusrite Liquid Sapphire 56. That's two TRS connectors because it's a stereo signal for left and right, and then just a FireWire connection to the computer. The problem with this setup is that if you go this route, all you're going to be able to do is play the synth and track everything that you play in as audio. You're not going to be able to quantize your MIDI notes or change velocities after you've played in the MIDI sequence. So this is the setup that I'm going with. I'm just plugging my Novation MIDI controller directly into my computer via USB. My Sapphire's plugged in via FireWire. In the back of my Focusrite interface, there's a MIDI in and a MIDI output plug, and most audio interfaces will have MIDI in and MIDI output, so there's no need for an external separate external MIDI interface. So all I'm doing is I'm plugging the output of my Focusrite into the input of the Motif. Now, some people will also plug the output of the Motif back into the input of the Focusrite. That's if the Motif needs to send, say, like clock values, like tempo changes and things like that, back to Logic so the two can communicate with each other. But for just to keep it simple today, I'm just doing out to in, no return back. And then I have again two TRS cables for stereo. That's going to be the main stereo output feeding back into Logic. So this is the way I'm going to do it, but there's some variations. One variation is if your synthesizer already has a USB input on it, like the Motif rack does. So instead of having to use those DIN connectors coming from the audio interface, all you'd have to do is just plug your synth in via USB. And some of them, some synths out there allow you to even bypass using the audio interface altogether. So you can really just hook the synth up and then forget about the audio interface, except to monitor your main levels. And then another alternative would be to use some sort of a USB MIDI interface. So again, we've just instead of using a DIN connector to come from our audio interface down to the Motif rack, you could directly connect a USB MIDI box like this. This is an M Audio MIDI Sport. It's a two channel. A 2x2, so it's technically 4 channels, 2 ins and 2 outs, and this can communicate the MIDI values out of Logic to the box and then ultimately down to the Yamaha Motif rack. So this is another way to do it if your audio interface does not have MIDI ports on the back of it. So let's get into Logic, and I'll show you how to set this up with the external instrument plugin. Alright, so to get started in advance, I put together a really simple musical example with 3 MIDI-based instruments, a drum loop, and a kick sample. For all 3 instruments, I'm just using Logic's stock electric piano instrument for now. We'll replace these tracks with the Motif rack sounds later. Let's just give this a listen real quick and see what it sounds like raw. So So next we need to create an external MIDI track so that we can send some of this MIDI data out to the motif rack. So I'm going to pull up the new track dialog by pressing Option Command N. I'm going to choose the external MIDI track and open up the additional details. And we're also going to choose the Use External Instrument plugin. Now we also need to choose the MIDI output to route our MIDI data out to the synthesizer. In my case, I'm using my Focusrite interface as my MIDI interface, so it says Liquid 56 MIDI 1. That's just saying that all the MIDI data on this new external MIDI track will go to MIDI channel 1 from my interface. If you're using a USB synth, that synth will show up in this menu as well, and you can select it directly. And if you're using a USB MIDI interface, like the M Audio one I showed earlier, that interface will show up here too. Again, remember that this is the MIDI output, not the audio output. MIDI data does not create any sound on its own. We're just sending the MIDI data through some interface to get to the motif so that the motif can generate the sound. You can also choose which MIDI channel you want to send the MIDI data through. This is really only applicable if you have multiple synths hooked up to a MIDI patch bay, each assigned to different channels, or if you have 2 or 3 synths that are daisy-chained together, again, all assigned to different channels. Since we're only using one synth here, I'm just going to choose all. I'm fairly certain my motif is currently set to channel 1, so either choosing channel 1 or choosing all will work here. Next, we need to choose the audio input where the sound generated by the motif will go to. I'm going to choose channels 7 and 8 because that's where I have the TRS cables coming from the motif plugged into. So we've got the whole signal chain set up now. MIDI data will be output to the motif from the Focusrite, and then sound from the motif will be returned back to Logic via the Focusrite on channels 7 and 8. So now I just hit create and it'll create our new external MIDI track. I'm going to rename it and call it Output to Motif. You'll also notice that the External Instrument Utility plugin shows up on the Instrument tab of the MIDI track. And if we open it, you'll see that all of the settings reflect what we chose earlier in the new tracks dialog. Now that we have that set up, as long as the external MIDI track is armed, we should be able to play our USB MIDI controller and hear sound. As you can see, the stock patch on the motif is a grand piano setting. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to pull down the chords region to my external MIDI track, and we should hear the chords sequenced through the stock piano setting on the motif. Cool, it seems to be working just fine. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a moment and just find a nice synth or string pad patch on the motif to work with. So I found a nice string pad I like. Let's see what this sounds like with the drum loops kicked back in. Cool, I like that. The next step is going to be to print the output of the motif to a new audio track. So I'm going to create a new audio track. We're going to make the input 7 and 8, so that's matching the inputs where the motif is going to. I'll hit create. So there's our new audio track to capture the audio. I'll call it Motif Strings. And I'm actually going to mute the track and arm the track. So this is going to allow us to capture the audio from the motif, but not hear both the external track and the audio tracks capture at the same time. All right, there we go. We captured our first recording from the motif. Notice I left quite a bit of tail on the end of that clip to make sure I get all the reverb in there. So all I have to do is repeat the process for the lead and the bass, and what I'll do is I'll find a nice patch that I like for both of those and print them as well. All right, off screen I found a patch for the bass and printed that, and now I'm gonna print the lead track. You'll notice that the synths and drums seem a little off rhythmically. This has something to do with Logic's delay compensation system, as well as the fact that I have my buffer size set to its maximum value, 1024. So you'll find sometimes that you have to nudge your audio slightly forward or backward after printing to make sure that it's properly aligned. You'll find that if you set your buffer size to the lowest value, like 32, as opposed to the max value, like I have here, 1024, you'll minimize latency issues. In my case, it looks like it wasn't a latency issue, but rather Logic's delay compensation system overcompensated, so the printed audio is actually slightly ahead of the rest of the track. This is actually pretty easy to fix. With snap mode off, I'll just drag this over into place using my bass and the kick drum as a reference. So let's see what this sounds like now. One last thing I want to cover is how to send controller messages to your external synth and have those interpreted along with your note on and note off messages. Keep in mind that note messages are not the only messages that the MIDI language interprets. CCs, or continuous controllers, are also MIDI messages that can be sent to an external synthesizer. This includes control messages like modulation wheel, faders, knobs, and the sustain pedal. The specific effect that the CCs are assigned to are controlled within the synthesizer. This particular patch on my motif has a vibrato effect that is engaged by pulling the modulation wheel upward. You can edit your controller messages by clicking on this button, which opens up the MIDI draw lane, which used to be called hyperdraw in Logic 9. On the left here, I can choose whatever controller I like. This is essentially MIDI automation. So for this patch, I want to automate the modulation wheel to engage and disengage that vibrato effect. So what I did was draw in some MIDI automation to ramp up the modulation wheel on the 4th note. This takes the place of me having to play in the mod wheel manually. So that wraps up this video on using external MIDI synths in Logic 10. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and thanks for watching. Hey guys, if you'd like to see more videos like this, subscribe to the channel to see multiple new videos added every week. Also, you can check out carnymediagroup.com, where you can view all of my video tutorials, search for specific topics, download the videos ad-free, and in some cases you can purchase session content so you can work along with me in the video. Also, please consider giving a monthly contribution at patreon.com/MusicTechHelpGuy. As always, thanks for your support and thanks for watching.